We're going to have some fun. We're going to talk some college football. And we want to get everybody's predictions in here. So this isn't just us talking and you guys listening. We want to hear what you all have to say. So we're going to make predictions for the Big Ten. Next week, we're going to go SEC, and then we're going to kind of work our way through the leagues moving forward as we finish these shows. So Big Ten East, Sean, I thought was, I mean, it's a no-brainer at the top. Obviously, it's Ohio State. We both had Ohio State. When I look at this Ohio State team, you know, they've got some things they got to work out. They've got some flaws, just like most teams do. But the gap in talent between Ohio State and everybody else in the Big Ten is still significant. I think some teams have recruited the last couple of years. Penn State's had a couple really nice recruiting classes in a row. And they got another one building now. I think they're slowly kind of, you know, closing the gap on Ohio State from a talent standpoint. I think the coaching is still a little bit off. Yeah. But I think, Sean, Ohio State still has the best talent. And I think Ryan Day made some changes this offseason that by the time you get to October, it's like this. If you don't beat Ohio, if some team in the Big Ten doesn't beat Ohio State by the first week in November, they're not going to. Because I think they're that team you want to catch them early, you know, as they're getting used to the new offensive line coach and the new defensive scheme and the new defensive staff. If you don't put an L on them, and if you're in the Big Ten team, if you don't put an L on them in the first 5-6 games, you're not putting an L on them. You're just not. Yeah. And I still think they're the class of the league at this point in time, and especially the East. I think the East is going to be competitive at the top, but I mean, Ohio State may catch a L this year. I mean, they may, but there's a pretty big gap, and I still believe this is a quarterback-driven situation. And I look at the quarterbacks in the league, and the next best quarterback is what? The kid from Michigan State in the East.
Yeah,
you know,
it's definitely not 14 in Happy Valley.
Right. But we'll get to him in a second because he is pretty important. But just as far as putting a team on his shoulders, he's just not that guy. No. But that right there, though, the fact that Penn State relies so heavily on Sean Clifford explains why there's a big gap between Ohio State and everybody else.
I totally agree. And the most important thing is that Ohio State knows it. And your point is right. Oregon caught them early last year.
Yeah.
And Minnesota. Because I think Minnesota, if they don't lose Ibrahim early in that game,
that would have been a really interesting game.
They would have pulled off. It would have been interesting. They had a great shot at pulling off that upset.
Mm-hmm.
And now you just have a really confident bunch of skill players at Ohio State, right?
Yep.
And I think that's where Notre Dame is headed to, where we're eventually going to be. Like, we won't be sitting here wondering who's going to step up. I think in 2 or 3 years, we're going to have the combination of Braylon James, Jaden Greathouse, and Rico Flores, and we're going to be talking about, I don't think anybody can stop us. So Michigan might be the only other team from a skill standpoint that really Michigan has some playmakers at different positions. They have Henning, Corum, Wilson.
They got Ronnie Bell back.
Ronnie Bell's back.
Anthony will be. So let's talk about that because we had a discussion. The 2 and 3. There's going to be a battle at 2 and 3, and I think the advantage that Michigan has is their schedule is much softer.
Yeah,
and they catch some breaks. So if you look at like Penn State has to play, because this is part of making a prediction. Is this I like Minnesota this year better than Wisconsin. I'm just not sure they're going to be able to finish higher than Wisconsin because of their schedule, which we'll get to. But you look at Penn State. Penn State has to play at Ohio State. I'm sorry, that was last year. They have to play at Michigan. And so it's kind of like, okay, if it comes down to they both have 2 losses, Penn State and Michigan have kind of pretty much beat each other up at on their home field. So like Michigan wins at home and then Penn State wins at home. That's kind of how that rivalry is kind of going back and forth. Penn State's going to have to beat Michigan this year at Michigan, to me, to have that head-to-head, because I could see them both having 2 conference losses, one to, like I could see Penn State losing to Ohio State at home and then losing at Michigan and having 2 losses. And then I could see Michigan having 2 losses because, for their team, I think there's some concerns I have for them. But then, they could lose at Ohio State. But then what's the other game they're going to lose? At Iowa, at Rutgers. They get Michigan State at home. They get Penn State at home. They get Nebraska at home. They get Illinois at home. Like, other than Ohio State, all their toughest games their arguably next two toughest games are at home, Nebraska and Penn State. Michigan State's going to be tough at Iowa, but to me, it's like, am I banking on, we'll get to him in a minute, but Spencer Petras to beat Michigan, like that's kind of the big thing for me, right?
Yeah.
But Michigan's going to be like pretty rested going into that Iowa game because their non-conference is embarrassing for a team like Michigan, Colorado State, Hawaii, and UConn, right? Like Hawaii at 6-7 is your best non-conference game. That's pretty embarrassing, right? So for me, I went with Penn State for a couple reasons, Sean. I think I think Ohio State's offense Michigan's offense, in my opinion, is one of the 2 or 3 most talented in the Big Ten, skill player wise, because they bring Blake Corum back. And they lost to Hassan Haskins, which is a big loss, but you and I both know that Donovan Edwards is a really talented player. Correct. Receiver, you talk about, they get Ronnie Bell back, who's more of an athlete than he is a pure receiver, but he's explosive.
Yeah.
Can AJ Henning step up? You've got Blake Corum coming out of the backfield, but then you look, they got some bigger receivers too, right? Like they've got Cornelius Johnson, who's 6'2", 6'3". Right. Darius Clemens comes in, who's as a true freshman, who I think 6'2", 210 can help you as right away. Andrew Anthony moves into year 2. Eric All's a really good tight end, in my opinion. You've got 3 starters coming back on your offensive line, but here's the problem: if Jim Harbaugh puts J.J. McCarthy in the starting lineup before the Iowa game, Michigan will finish second in the Big Ten East this year. If he tries to ride the Cade McNamara game until they lose, then they will finish third. So really my prediction and I'm predicting he's going to try to ride McNamara. That's my prediction. If I'm wrong, Michigan jumps up to number 2 because, as you said, their offensive line won't be as good as it was last year. It's still going to be good, but they're going to be much better. They're going to be much more – they're going to be deeper and have better skill on the perimeter, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But they just don't have the signal caller right now, to me, to go through a schedule of at Iowa, at Indiana, Penn State at home, Michigan State at home, Nebraska at home, Illinois at home, and at Ohio State, to go through all those and not stub their toe. Because that's the whole thing we saw last year. The Big Ten was down, in my opinion, last year, and Michigan took advantage. Yeah. But it was because of their offense. Yeah. I mean, do I need to remind you of the Penn State game? Do I need to remind you of the Rutgers game where they won 20-13? You know what I mean? Like, there were some games where you're like, man, this offense is just, they had some good games too, but I mean, Michigan State, everybody scored on Michigan State last year.
That's once Ronnie Bell went out, it was like,
right. So to me, that's the key for me is he going to be willing to make the tough, because it's not easy to take a kid who started for you last year, who led you to the playoff, led you to a Big Ten title, and say, hey man, we love you, thanks for everything you did, but we're going to go with this guy.
Yeah, but you need to be able to make that decision as a visionary. Right. That's your job as a head coach.
Right.
To be able to recognize early. Don't be like John Cooper and wait until the week before the Michigan game and you're undefeated to replace Stanley Jackson with Joe Germain. Right. Like, no. Like, if you make that move, you do it early in the season.
Right.
You ride it out. So I agree with you. It's going to come down to his decision. Their pass rush, they have talent, young talent on the defensive line, but the pass rush might not be as dynamic as it was last year. So there will be a need for the offense to be more dynamic.
Right. The defense won't be right. The defense won't be bad.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But you can't just lose Aiden Hutchinson and David Ajabo Dax Hill and Mike McDonald as your D coordinator and just keep rolling. They don't have the talent to step in and replace. They're not reloading the way that other teams are.
Right.
Like Michael Morris is a good player on the edge, right? Taylor Upshaw is a nice player on the edge, but they're not Aiden Hutchinson and David Ajabo, right? So other guys are going to have to step up. Their experience at linebacker coming back, but they're not going to be able to just go out there and win 17-13 games this year. They're going to need to be able to score a little bit, and I think they can. Now, Penn State, on the other hand, is a really interesting team because I actually think Penn State has a lot better talent than people realize. I think they're the team that can actually compete with Michigan next for the second most talent on the skill positions. And I know that may sound crazy because they lost Jahan Dotson.
Yeah.
But they got some really good receivers coming back. I like Parker Washington a lot. They've got some good running back step into the equation. Nicholas Singleton is the kind of kid that can just step on a field as a true freshman and say, I'm the best back you got. I mean, that's the kind of talent Nicholas Singleton has, in my opinion. And they got some other kids that stepped in. I think that the Saunders kid that they landed last year, Caden Saunders, that they got out of Ohio, can kind of step in and fill somewhat of the void that Jahan brought from a down the field standpoint. He's not going to be Jahan Dotson as an all-around player. But just the speedy, shifty, vertical guy, he can fill a little like the Braden Lindsay role. I think he can bring some of that as a freshman. I think their offensive line was a little beat up last year. They're going into another year with their offensive line coach, who I think has a good reputation. He inherited a bit of a mess, Phil Troutwine. So I think the unit's going to be better. Salim Wormley comes back from an injury. They're going to be better up front. Kid that a lot of Notre Dame fans are going to remember, Landon Tangwall, slated to start at left guard for them, which is where we always thought he was better suited anyway, was a guard. So I actually think Penn State is a good football team. The problem is they've got a Cade McNamara type of situation too at quarterback. Now, the thing I love about Sean Clifford is the kid's a winner, though. I mean, he's that kid that if the game's on the line, you feel like he's going to make a play. And he's also that kind of kid, Sean, that has always said he's not afraid of big moments. He's not. And Sean Clifford does not think he's as untalented as he actually is. That's the good thing for him and the problem for opponents. Is Sean Clifford thinks he's better than he is, and he has that type of mentality and that mindset of you give me the ball at the end of the game. I mean, you look at their games last year, Sean. I mean, let's look at Penn State's results last year. They lost to so the first loss, they start 5-0, beat Wisconsin on the road, beat Auburn. Right. Their first loss was on the road against at Iowa, 23-20. It was 20-0 when Sean Clifford got hurt.
Yeah, they win that game with Sean Clifford
easily. The next week they lose in overtime at 9 overtimes to Illinois. Sean Clifford played, but he was not right.
Right.
He was not right. Then they go lose to Ohio State by 9. That was a game they battled, right? Ohio State just had better players. They lose to Michigan by 4, and again, their offense just never quite recovered. And then they lost to Michigan State by 3. So this is a team that was out there losing competitive games. They have a small margin for error, but I feel like with Clifford coming back, as long as he's not too distracted with all the NIL stuff he's trying to get involved in, that's my only concern about that.
Yeah,
is can he's trying to build this union, and he's got his own NIL company. All this, like, hey, let's make sure you're ready to play some football too, there, buddy.
Yeah.
Right. So that's my only concern with him. But if he can be healthy, I think Penn State can give Michigan a run for that number 2 spot. And the biggest reason is I think that the schedule is somewhat favorable for them. They get Ohio State at home.
State at home, yeah.
And if Ohio State's going to lose a game in the Big Ten, it's going to be to Penn State. Because of all the teams in the Big Ten, that is the one team that year after year after year is just not afraid of Ohio State. Now, they lose more often than not because they're just – Ohio State's better coached. James Franklin is and this is the other thing. All my issues with Jim Harbaugh. He's a solid in-game coach. Not great. He's solid. James Franklin's a terrible in-game coach. Right? So if everything is equal, he's going to make some dumb decision that's going to cost you a ball game.
Yeah.
But they have not, say what you want about James Franklin. He has his teams mentally ready to play Ohio State every single time they step on the field.
Yeah, I agree.
Including games where they're completely outclassed talent-wise, like the last 2 years.
Yep.
And they get them at home. If Ohio State's going to lose a game, it's going to be that one. I'm not predicting they will. I think Ohio State's going to run the table in the Big Ten this year. But, I think that's the game to watch. That's a game to watch. There's a couple games to watch, but that more than any is the one that you look at because they're not going to be afraid of them. No. The question is can they avoid, losing at Michigan, and can they avoid upsets? Home against Michigan State, home against Minnesota, home against or at Purdue. Those are games where they got to handle their business. They can handle their business, then I think that they'll be the number 2 team in the league because I think they can beat Michigan. I do. If Cade McNamara is your starting quarterback.
And that goes back to just the entire conference being a lot more competitive.
Right.
Because the West will be more competitive.
Right.
Those big teams in the East are going to have a more difficult time when they have to face those teams from the West. So I think the order is pretty much spot on. 2-3, Michigan, Penn State can flip flop. It's going to, I think Penn State is the better team, and we're not being disrespectful in saying that because I think Michigan State is going to be solid.
Right, they're just going to be 4th.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
they'll be solid. And they could pull a couple of upsets.
I mean, they're still going to be a good team.
Yeah.
I mean, but they're just not going to be as good as those other teams.
No.
I mean, and when you look at Michigan State last year, they were a good team last year, but they barely beat Michigan and barely beat Indiana and, barely beat Nebraska. And they, honestly, here's my take on Michigan State. I felt like they kind of won with a little bit of smoke and mirrors last year, to be honest with you. I think they took advantage of the league being down. I think Coach Tucker did a good job of developing them to be a really physical team on offense. They rode Kenny Walker big time last year.
Big time athlete, yeah.
But I think losing him and losing the receiver that they lost is going to hurt them more than people think, because their margin for error was really thin, in my opinion. And so that's kind of my issue with Michigan State. And the other thing too is when I look at Michigan State is they catch a couple disadvantages from a scheduling standpoint as well, that I think is going to factor into this too. Because again, we're talking about like these teams being split by like a game. Like we're not talking about Michigan State going like 6-6 this year. Right. But when you look at their schedule, they play at Maryland, and that just is a bad matchup for Michigan State, in my opinion, because here's the thing. Michigan State was one of the worst pass defenses I've ever seen last year. I mean, they were really bad. And when Maryland's on Tungavaloa with the receivers he's got, Raheem Jarrett and Demas and all, I mean, they got some weapons. That's a bad matchup for Michigan State, in my opinion.
Demas is coming back.
Yeah. Yes. And you just don't know which version of Maryland's going to show up. That's the problem. But they also play at Michigan and at Illinois and at Penn State. And we'll get to Illinois in a second, but that's not going to be an easy game to play. And honestly, the thing that's going to hurt them too is they play at home against Ohio State and Wisconsin. Especially Ohio State is like, this is a year, if you're trying to battle for that number 2 spot, John, this is the year you want Ohio State on the road. So catch that L on the road so you can get another team at home, right? But they're like, to me, the opposite of Penn State. Michigan State has had some really good teams get annihilated by Ohio State.
Yep.
I mean, it's like, remember 2017 and a really good football team? They went out and got absolutely annihilated by Ohio State. Last year's another 56-7. And honestly, watching that game, it could have been worse. I mean, they had no answers for Ohio State, and it's just one of those things where it's kind of weird. Like the years that Michigan State's given Ohio State a game are years when they weren't that good, and Ohio State just kind of sleptwalked on them.
Yeah.
But like 2017, that Michigan State team won 10 games and had a really good football team, beat Washington State in the bowl game, beat Penn State. Look what happened when they went to Ohio State, 48-3. I mean, they're not even competitive against Ohio State. So I just don't see that changing now that they don't have Kenneth Walker. I don't see that changing. So I think Michigan State's schedule, because again, we're talking real life here, right?
Yeah.
It's not what we feel or who we like. You got to look to make a prediction. You got to look at the schedule and say, this team may be slightly better, but their schedule's a little tougher, and that's just going to hurt them a little bit. So I thought Michigan State played a little bit over their ability last year.
Yeah.
And this year, I don't think they're going to be able to get away with that, because I think Penn State's going to be better. Michigan's still going to be a tough matchup for them. There's some other teams on the schedule I think are going to give them a tough time. So that's why we have them 4th. Then we have Maryland 5th. They're going to have some wins which are like, wow, that's a heck of an upset for Maryland, because they got some athletes. And then they're going to have some games where like, oh, how did they lose to that team? How'd they lose by 25 at home to a team with 3 wins? Like, how did that happen?
I think this is a big year for Mike Locksley.
Yeah.
Big year. He needs to come up with 8 to 9 wins.
Yeah.
Show some progress in their program. Because like you said, they've had athletes.
Yeah.
Especially on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah.
To be able to put up points, they've still found a way to.
Is that running back they had a couple years ago? It's his first year. Remember that kid? The kid from Maryland?
Number 5, right?
Oh, yeah. Anthony McFarland.
Yeah.
After Ohio State, a case could be made that the most dynamic 1-2 punch at receiver in the conference is the 2 kids from Maryland potentially coming into this year, Demas and Raheem Jarrett.
Yeah,
it's a conversation to have, but they're in the conversation.
Yeah,
and Tungavaloa looks like some weeks he just looks like this kid shouldn't be starting at quarterback in the Big Ten, and then other weeks you're like, yo, this kid is throwing some dimes.
Yeah,
does he become more consistent this year?
Yeah,
I have a hard time believing he's going to be more consistent because of the program he plays in.
Yep,
it's one of the most undisciplined programs you're going to find. And if you know Mike Locksley, you understand why.
why,
right? And then I have Indiana 6 and Rutgers 7. The only reason I have Rutgers 7, I think Indiana's going to struggle. I love Tom Allen. I just don't think he's a head coach. I think they lost too much talent. I don't like the kid they got coming in from Missouri. I think but the reason I have Rutgers finishing 7th, I think Rutgers is going to have a lot of competitive losses. Gavin Wimsatt is a kid is going to be a future standout in the Big Ten, but he's technically a freshman, really age-wise, because he enrolled early. Not enrolled early, he reclassified and played for them last year. That's going to benefit him more next year than this year. The problem is for Rutgers, and the reason I have them finishing 7th, their schedule is brutal.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm like looking at their schedule. I'm like, that's just not even fair looking at their schedule. They play at Boston College in the non-conference. Then they play home against Iowa, at Ohio State, home against Nebraska, Indiana at home, at Minnesota, home against Michigan, at Michigan State, home against Penn State, at Maryland. Like, that's a brutal schedule for Rutgers. So I think their record is not going to reflect how competitive they're going to be this year.
Yeah, I think Greg Schiano was finding it a little bit more difficult in his second term to kind of create the same buzz. But, I give them credit, man. They play physical. They play tough.
Right.
And like you said, they showed up they gave Michigan State a heck of a game at Rutgers. They gave Michigan a heck of a game.
Yep.
At the Big House last year.
Yep.
So,
they've almost beat Michigan twice. Or didn't they? They almost beat Michigan the year before. Lost 48-42 in the COVID year.
Yeah.
Yeah. They play hard, Sean. I think with the schedule that they have, for me, it's just one of those things where they're going to be better than their record shows. I think he's adding talent.
Yeah.
I think they play hard. They compete. It's just the schedule set up really rough for them.
Really rough.
That's my only concern.
Yeah.
Now they can pull off some upsets, right? Because again, I mean, they went 5-7 last year. They're not a bad football team.
Yeah.
But they beat Temple, they beat Syracuse, they beat Delaware, they beat Illinois, and they beat Indiana. Right? Like, I think they're going to be a better football team than Indiana. Yeah. I just think Indiana's got a more favorable conference schedule. But it wouldn't shock me to see Rutgers be ahead of them. And and then the other thing that hurts them is I just feel like the top of the conference is so heavy. It's like there's the top 4, and then there's a bit of a gap, and then there's Maryland and Rutgers and Indiana. So it's going to be interesting. Let's go to the West.
Let's do it.
I would argue there's 5 teams that would not shock me to see win the West. And we both went so we kind of made our predictions before we talked just to kind of see where we were, and we fell in the same line. We both have Nebraska winning the conference. Now that may seem crazy when you consider they went 3-9 last year, but they were the best 3-9 team I've ever seen in my life. You don't see teams go 3-9, outscore their opponents by over 60 points last year, because their worst loss was 9 points to Ohio State in a game where they had the ball in the fourth quarter with a chance to take the lead.
Yeah. That 3-9, look, if he has an average quarterback,
right,
that 3-9 is 7-5, 8-4.
Right.
Easily.
Right.
They are physical up front, both sides of the ball. I think it's Mark Whipple is the new offensive coordinator. From Pitt. So we'll see how that goes. And once again, I mean, it's about 4 or 5 coaches in the Big Ten that this is possibly a make or break year. It's no different for Scott Frost.
Right.
Defensive, like I said, he lost a lot in his secondary to the NFL, but he's been able to get talent.
Right.
And he's been able to recruit the line of scrimmage.
And they got a lot of transfers this offseason.
Yeah, the quarterback situation, of course, is going to be the tell.
Yep.
That's going to be the tell for Nebraska.
Yep. I mean, look, and people that didn't pay attention to Nebraska, there's somebody spouting off at the mouth, in the chat about Nebraska. Like, look, you can look at the 3-9 and say whatever you want to say, but the reality is you watch that team play, they had a lot of teams on the ropes. They couldn't finish. What's funny is, what the worst loss they had all year was? It's Illinois, because it was not as close as the 8-point loss. But the rest of the games, they had Oklahoma beat. They had Michigan State beat. They handed those games away. They had Michigan on the ropes with a chance to win in the fourth quarter. They were not a bad team in regards to how they played. They were a bad team based on their record. And that's the point. I mean, they lost by a touchdown to Iowa. They lost by a touchdown to Wisconsin. They lost by 9 to Ohio State. They lost by 5 to Purdue. They lost by a touchdown to Minnesota. They lost by 3 to Michigan. They lost by 3 to Michigan State on the road. They lost by a touchdown at Oklahoma. Like, they were a team that competed. And they got the best JUCO back, number one JUCO back in the country is there. They got a Trey Palmer from LSU that is transferring in as a receiver. Now, I'm not someone who's like, oh, get all these transfers and you're going to be great, right? But I think they got enough transfers to where they can supplement where their roster lacked players. Yeah. You talked about how they lost some guys. Well, they got an Arizona State transfer to help fill some of that void. They've got some young recruits that they landed that are now stepping into certain spots that I think are going to help them. They've got a pretty good offensive line, in my opinion. Tanner Corcoran's one of the best offensive linemen in the Big Ten. At right tackle. I mean, he's really good. The key is here's the thing I'll say about Nebraska. They will not be they will not be a team that wins 5 to 7 games. Won't happen. No. They're either going to win the Big Ten West or they're going to implode and he's going to be gone.
He's going to be gone. Yeah.
I think it's going to be one of those two things. It reminds me a lot of the 2000. You know who they remind me a lot of, Sean, is the 2016 Notre Dame team. I said before that season, I said Notre Dame is either going to be really good or really bad. And I meant really bad at like 5-6 wins.
Yeah.
And they don't have the talent that Notre Dame had, I don't think, the top level talent. But the problem for Nebraska was a team that has an extreme lack of discipline. Yeah. And the lack of discipline becomes because they have a head coach that lacked discipline in his own, how he went about his business. Supposedly he's cleaned that stuff up.
Or was told to clean it up.
There you go. He cleaned it up. I don't think it was him having to come to Jesus moment with himself. I think it was like, well, if you want to keep your job, you better grow up.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so can he push the right buttons to say, hey, look, guys, let's fix these things? Because, I mean, they would like do things where you're like, they gave you that game. If they just stop losing games, teams weren't beating Nebraska. Nebraska was losing games to them because of the things that they were doing. And so to me, if they clean that up, it's a sign that he has turned the corner in how to run a program, and they will be, because in my opinion, Sean, they are the most talented team in the West. Mm-hmm. But they were one of the 3 most talented teams in the West last year too, and they went 3-9. Right? And so that's going to be the thing is this is not going to be a 7-5 team in my opinion. Because if he doesn't make the changes to get them over that hump, then they're still going to do the same things.
Yeah.
The other thing about Nebraska you have to consider is the schedule. And Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin, to me, all have significantly tougher schedules. If you look at their schedule, they get Minnesota at home and they get Wisconsin at home. They'd have 2 tough road games in the league, at Michigan, at Iowa. Those are their tough road games. The rest of they don't get Ohio State. They don't get Michigan State. And they don't get Penn State this year. Their crossover games are Michigan and Indiana and Rutgers. Right. So again, y'all, you got to look at that as you're making decisions about who you're picking.
Absolutely.
Right. So now the Michigan game is going to be tough. The Iowa, the last 3 games are going to, but if Nebraska's an 8, if Nebraska's like 8-1 going into the last game, they also get Oklahoma at home to start the season. They play Northwestern in Dublin. That should be a win. They get North Dakota the next week, Georgia Southern, and they get Oklahoma at home. We're going to know that week if Scott Frost has his team turned around. Here's the other thing you have to remember, that they're playing one of those week 0 games. So Nebraska is going to have 2 byes during the regular season. So they're going to get a bye between Oklahoma and Indiana, and then they get another bye later in the month between Purdue and Illinois. That's going to help them too in regards to being fresh. And so to me, Sean, if he turns the corner as a coach, they will be the best team in the West. If he doesn't, they're going to implode again, and he won't finish the season.
I think this is, it comes full circle because USC and UCLA are coming to the Big Ten. But I think you can blame Chip Long and Nebraska for showing Oklahoma where their program was from a physical standpoint.
Right.
When both of those teams walked in Norman and physically stood up to Oklahoma, Yep, I think that's when the light went off. Like, oh, USC. What were you saying again?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right.
I really, because I think you started to see like, yo, this Oklahoma program is nowhere near as physical as they've been when these two teams can walk in and be physical and successful. So that's what we're talking about. Like, you go watch that Nebraska-Oklahoma game and you come away saying, my God, Adrian Martinez is so bad.
Yes.
Like, if Nebraska, dude,
you said, Sean, you said it. If they just have an okay quarterback,
they blow Oklahoma out.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
He was missing, like, he looked like Brandon against Stanford.
Yes.
Is how, like, all year.
Yes.
All year. I mean, missing guys are like, there was one game, it was like a third down, and he has a guy in the flat, Sean. There's not a defender on the TV screen, and he throws it like 3 feet over the guy's head. And you're like, what the heck is going on? So, but, is Casey Thompson the answer? I mean, but again, it's not that Casey Thompson's good, because he's not, but he's at least okay compared to what they had. This is what I don't think people understand. This is a very talented Nebraska football team, athletically.
Yeah.
What they're not talented is up here, and that starts at the top of the program. If he can fix that, that
could be a problem with Casey Thompson, because when he goes in the tank, he goes in the tank.
Yep.
So maybe he can rewire the kid and he can produce. I mean, like, you go watch him early against Oklahoma. He was on fire.
Yep.
So we'll see.
So 2, 3, and 4 were also challenging. And I mean, you could really, it's Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin in some order is what we have. And it was really a battle. It really came down to me to schedule and defense.
Mm-hmm.
And I went with Iowa at 2, Sean, but it was one of the more uncomfortable predictions I made. It's not one that I'm like, I'm betting my mortgage this month on Iowa finishing second.
Yeah.
I could see Iowa winning the Big Ten West. I could see Iowa finishing 4th. The reality of is the reason I went with them second is, number one, I think they have the best coach in the Big Ten. That's what I think. I think Kirk Ferentz is an outstanding football coach. And he, I mean, talk to me. What, they were a Big Ten West champ last year? Why? Because they had the best center in college football. That's why they won the no, because they're incredibly well coached football, and they caught some breaks, like Sean Clifford getting hurt. Yeah,
you talking about Kirk Ferentz? His staff is unbelievable.
Now, Phil Parker retired this offseason, correct?
Yeah.
That's another reason I'm not able to put them number one, because he was one of the most underappreciated coaches in college football the last decade.
Absolutely.
But when I look at them, they've got weapons coming back in the pass game. They're going to be good on the offensive line. Their tight end's arguably the best tight end in college football, or excuse me, in the Big Ten. And they've got all but one starter coming back in the front seven. They've got like 9 starters coming back on defense. That's it right there. It's the coaching and the fact they're going to be really good on defense that has me there. The also is the only reason I don't have them first, because of their quarterback. He's one of the most inaccurate quarterbacks in the country.
Yeah.
If he's just consistent, they're going to win the West, in my opinion.
Yeah,
but I just have no faith in him. And then when you look at the schedule, that hurts him a little bit too. So, their schedule's a little bit challenging this year. The top teams in the West, other than Nebraska, have brutal schedules, in my opinion. They got to play Michigan at home, at Illinois, at Ohio State, Northwestern at home, at Purdue, home against Wisconsin, at Minnesota, home against Nebraska. So that's going to be a challenge for them. And so that's going to be an interesting battle, in my opinion, to see how they play. Because, again, they don't have I would argue, Sean, you tell me if you agree or disagree with this. I would make the statement that of the 4 teams we talked about, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, that Iowa has the least amount of talent of those 4 teams, especially top-level talent.
It's debatable. They lost. Wait a minute. Didn't they lose Charlie Jones, too?
Mm-hmm.
The receiver? Didn't he transfer?
Mm-hmm. What transfer to Purdue?
You're right.
They lost their running back.
Yeah.
They lost the All-American center.
Smart move by Charlie Jones.
Yes.
Like, he recognizes, like, you know what? Let me go get my numbers up.
Because he's going to be a return guy at Iowa.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he got, so Sean, to me, Iowa, I have number 2 because I think their schedule and the fact that I have more faith that I know who they're going to be this year. Right. Yeah. But I could easily see them being 4th. And that's the thing about this, the West, is it is going to be a battle. I mean, it just comes down to whose schedule was this or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And, that's just kind of where it is. So number 3, I initially had Minnesota. I eventually flipped it to Wisconsin because of Minnesota's schedule. That's really the only thing holding me back. I would argue that if we're just talking about best roster, Nebraska has the best roster in the Big Ten West. I think Minnesota is actually next. And the reason I have a lot more faith in Minnesota, Sean, as you and I have talked about, I've told them as a potential sleeper team. I won't be shocked if Minnesota wins the West, but the schedule is the reason I have them where I have them. Because they got to play at Michigan State, home against Purdue, at Illinois, at Penn State, at Rutgers, at Wisconsin. Not in order. I mean, that's order of the road games. But again, here's their road games this year: at Michigan State, at Illinois, at Penn State, at Nebraska, at Wisconsin. They have home games against Iowa, Northwestern, Purdue, and Rutgers in Colorado, Western Illinois, and New Mexico State. So their schedule is the thing that, for me, and the fact that they lost 4 starting offensive linemen.
Yeah.
Those are the 2 things for me. Now, they got some transfers in. Quinn Carroll from Notre Dame is supposed to start at guard for them. But the big thing for them, why I have more faith in Minnesota, is they got rid of Mike Sanford Jr. and brought back the offensive coordinator they had a couple years ago and went 11-2. And I'm not saying that to take a shot at him. Just the fact is he just was ineffective. Tanner Morgan and him just did not mesh for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And then Ibrahim comes back because he, to me, was the best returning back in the Big Ten last year. Now, Travion Henderson's a beast, but he was a freshman last year.
Yeah.
Ibrahim, to me, was the best veteran running back in the Big Ten last year. He was putting work in against Ohio State.
Yes, he was.
But they're going to have some weapons at a receiver. Tanner Morgan comes back for his 9th year. He's on the Hunter Renfrow plan at Minnesota, right? I think he's back to the OC that he had so much production with.
Yeah.
If the offensive line can get figured out, that was my other big thing, the schedule and the fact that they're a team that needs the offensive line to play well, and they lost 4 of them, 4 starters on the offensive line.
Yeah.
That concerns me a little bit. And their defense is okay, but it's not great. So you add all those things together with the tough schedule. I have them 4th, but honestly, I would not be shocked if Minnesota wins it. I won't be shocked if any of the 4 teams at the top win it. I'll be a little surprised about Illinois. We'll get to them in a minute. But I honestly think Minnesota could be a tough team, Sean. But I want to get your thoughts on Wisconsin because I'm having a tough time with Wisconsin because I don't see the talent, Sean. Now, here's the question. Was it as simple as the offensive line coach just wasn't up to par? And now that Bob Bostad is back coaching the offensive line, they're going to get back to being Wisconsin? Or is it what I think it is, which is just they just don't have the players they used to have. Now, I think Braylon Allen at running back is going to be a dude if the offensive line can get figured out. But they're receiving they always had at least one good player at receiver.
But they lost their top 3 skill guys.
Yeah.
Tight end Jake Ferguson, he's in the NFL. They lose Pryor, they lose Davis.
Right.
Where are they going on the outside? I agree with you with the running back. The young kid is going to be really, really good at that offensive line. Is back to the original self.
Right.
Defensively, it's just the reputation of Jim Leonard.
Right.
And which is well earned.
Right.
Well earned.
Yep.
Right? He's taken, your grandmother, scraps in the pantry.
Right.
And made some really good meals.
Right.
Some really good defenses. So, Paul Chris is a really good coach.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good staff. He got the offensive line situation taken care of, shored up. We'll see.
It's the talent. That's my thing.
Yeah.
But was it a situation?
The talent. What about that schedule?
Right. That's the other part of it. Yeah. So
the
here,
2 road games that crossover.
here's Wisconsin's first Big Ten game at Ohio State. They also play at Michigan State, at Iowa, at Nebraska. They get Minnesota at home, Maryland at home, Purdue at home. But their schedule is tough, but it's not as tough as Minnesota's, which is why I ended up putting Wisconsin ahead of Minnesota.
Yeah.
But what I want to know, Sean, is and we can't answer this now. My question is the issues that they've had on the offensive line, is it similar to Notre Dame's, where they've had the players are there, they just don't look like you're used to because you haven't had the guy that could get them ready to go? I don't watch enough of Wisconsin to say that as definitively as I do about Notre Dame. I watch Notre Dame every week, so I know there's talent there. They're just not coached. That's going to be the thing we're going to find out this year with Bostad back on the offensive line, because he was the offensive line coach during some of the early runs.
Yeah.
And he went to the NFL, and then he wanted – so he was actually – he's been the linebackers coach at Wisconsin. He was actually somebody that Notre Dame interviewed to replace Harry Hiestand. And he was one of the guys. So there was 2 guys that Chip Long really wanted and the O-line players really wanted.
Yeah.
They wanted Joe Gilbert, who Chip had coached with before, who's now with Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And the other one was Bob Bostad, was the other one that they liked. And so to me, that was kind of the thing, was he just wanted to be at Wisconsin. He loves Wisconsin. That's just his place. You know, he went to the NFL and came back to Wisconsin. He didn't want to leave Wisconsin.
Right.
And he didn't get offered by Notre Dame. Just saying in general, he would be willing to stay as linebackers coach than go somewhere else. And that's why the only school he really interviewed for was Notre Dame, because it's Notre Dame, right? If the issue at Wisconsin is the same as Notre Dame's, where the talent was there in the offensive line, it's the coaching, then you could potentially jump Wisconsin up to 1 or 2. Right? It's just that. But the hesitancy I still have, Sean, is they just don't have the perimeter playmakers.
No,
that they've always had, Aberderis or like the kid Cephas, like the kid they had a couple years. They've always had like Danny Davis. They've had like at least one guy that you're like, and they've always had a tight end. And I just don't know if they're going to have it this year.
Or even going back to Chambers back in the day, they always had a deep threat. That one guy that could keep you honest with your safety, so they can run the ball and do what they want to do. But getting to your question, I truly believe that what happened with Paul Chris is that he fell in love with what he perceived as an opportunity to become more diverse offensively, and tried to step away from the identity of who Wisconsin is. And that was just too much trust they placed on Graham Mertz. Like, he bust on the scene as a freshman and threw 5 touchdowns against Illinois in his first Big Ten game. And they thought, yo, this is our opportunity to have a quarterback that can really open our offense. And then halfway through the season, they realized, like, oh, snap.
He wasn't ready yet.
They went on the road, and Minnesota physically handled them at the end of the season.
Yep.
Physically handled them.
Wasn't it in Wisconsin?
No, it was at Minnesota.
Okay.
I think that game was at Minnesota.
In 2020, you're talking about, right?
No.
Last year?
Last year.
Oh, yeah. It was at Minnesota, yeah.
It was at Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken. And because I think Wisconsin still had an opportunity to win the West.
Sean, they were rolling. They only had 1 conference loss or 2 conference losses at that point in time. They lost to Penn State in the opener, and then they lost to Michigan in October 2nd. But they had won 7 games in a row, 6 conference games. But they had beaten Illinois. They were winning games convincingly. Beat Illinois 24-0, beat Purdue 30-13, beat Iowa 27-7, beat Rutgers 52-3, beat Northwestern 35-7. They had a battle against Nebraska 35-28, but they outplayed Nebraska in that game.
Yeah.
That was actually one of Nebraska's better games last year. And then they went on to Minnesota, like you said, Sean, and it was not competitive.
Yeah.
It was not competitive.
Look, Wisconsin came in with a chance to make it. I think they needed some help from Iowa.
Yeah.
But they came in with a chance to win the Big Ten West. And, they just got steamrolled physically by Minnesota. who had dealt with injuries all year, and it was just unexpected. So I think they got away from their identity.
Yeah.
And I think they placed a lot on Graham Mertz, and it was too late when they finally realized, like, oh, they should have known after the Notre Dame game, like, oh, no, this isn't good. And now we get to see, did he learn his lessons? Did the moves he made on his coaching staff, will they end up? And like we said, you have to place a lot of trust in Jim Leonard. You just have to, because he's continued to be a top 5 defense, in the nation.
They're one of the toughest, best coach, fundamentally sound defenses in college football. For him to have the kind of defenses he has with the talent he has, and look, they don't have bums running out there, but they don't have a bunch of high draft. There's no J.J. Watt running through running through there right now. There's no Jamar Fletcher lining up a cornerback, right? Like, they don't have that kind of talent. He is a phenomenal defensive coordinator, and somebody that Marcus Freeman tried to convince to interview for the job, and he won't leave Wisconsin. He's just happy there. Again, Marcus Freeman tried to make a run at him, from what I'm told, for the D coordinator job when Marcus Freeman was hired as head coach.
That's the smartest thing he's done. Because that dude gets it done. He gets it done. You talking about just fundamentally sound and physical, and kids will run through a brick wall for him. So that 4-3-4 is going to I think it's going to be dependent upon Wisconsin.
Yeah.
I think Wisconsin will decide. Because I think they're better as a program than Minnesota.
Yes. And they're better coached than Minnesota.
They're better coached than Minnesota. And if they play to their level,
here's the problem with Wisconsin, where I think Paul Chryst has struggled at times in his career, is with recruiting. When I look at the athletes that Minnesota has running around, it's not comparable to the athletes that Wisconsin has running around in Minnesota's favor. That's the problem. And that's where I think, look, Minnesota can get Rashad Bateman and Tyler Johnson, but Wisconsin can't get one of those guys. You know what I mean? Like, that to me is where they've done a poor job, in my opinion, of recruiting.
Yeah.
Is just not being able to just bring out some guys that you don't need stars. You don't need Jaden Greathouse and Braylon James. You just need a Jared Abbrederis. You just need, guys like that. You just need solid players that can be good enough to complement your run game.
Right.
And they just haven't done that. And I think that's been my issue with Paul Chryst, is I think, as far as his teams are going to be fundamentally sound, they're going to be tough, they're going to be physical. But we saw the Notre Dame game last year. Eventually, Notre Dame's athletes just took the game over. And it didn't matter that the best coach team on the field that day was clearly Wisconsin. They were more fundamentally sound. They were tougher. They were more physical. It's just their dudes weren't as good as Notre Dame's dudes.
Yeah.
And Notre Dame's kids, that was one of the few games all year where I felt like Notre Dame played hard in that game. They met Wisconsin physically. Now, we've talked about they weren't a real physical football team. That was one of the exceptions. I was pleased with how Notre Dame brought it in most. Their offensive line got their butts kicked. Just got their butts kicked for 60 minutes. But the Notre Dame front seven brought it against Wisconsin last year.
Absolutely.
The DBs brought it against Wisconsin last year. And they did. And that's why Notre Dame was able to win that game, is because they just had way better dudes, and they were able to match them. The offense of Wisconsin's physicality. Now, they also benefited from the fact that Ches Malusi was the running back and not Braylon Allen, because they were a much better team once Braylon Allen came over. Because Ches Malusi's a good running back, but he's not your typical. They've had a lot of Ches Malusis over the year, but it was always the guy they were bringing off the bench, the James Whites that they were bringing off the bench as the number 2 to complement Monty Ball and Melvin Gordon and Jonathan Taylor and then Braylon Allen, right? So it's going to be an interesting aspect of it, Sean. I know you want to get to the next team. I know. When I told Sean who my number 5 team was, he got all excited, because if y'all don't know, Sean is a graduate of the University of Illinois. Yeah. And we've talked about some of the great games he was in the stands for back when he was a student. I have Illinois 5, Sean, and as I said to you, they are a dark horse if everything goes right team for me this year. Because the one thing Illinois has is they have some athletes. They were and for all their issues last year, you kind of wondered, like, how is Bielema going to be? now that he's back in college football? Is he going to be happy there? Or is Illinois just a kind of a stopgap for him to kind of get to the next job? I'm going to tell you what, I was impressed with how those teams played last year.
Yeah.
Because even the games they lost, they were competitive.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't – I mean, and it started at the beginning. I was like, man, this team's going to be this team's going to have a little something this year because they came out in the opener and just worked Nebraska in the opener. I mean, worked Nebraska.
And if they didn't turn the ball over,
yeah,
it would have been worse.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then they got smacked by Virginia and lost to Texas San Antonio. And I'm thinking, man, that's bad. Yeah. Well, then you realize Texas San Antonio
team was really good, though.
Yeah. And the Virginia loss, like you you guys got torched by Brennan Armstrong because Brennan Armstrong in 2020 and 19 didn't look like Brennan Armstrong in 2021. But then you started to see him kind of, okay, they're battling. They lost by 3 to Maryland, lost by 4 to Purdue, lost 24-0 to Wisconsin, beat Penn State in overtime, lost to Rutgers by 6, which is still just a bad loss. Like, how did you lose at home to Rutgers? They beat Minnesota on the road, blew Northwestern out, lost by 10 to Iowa. And a game was competitive. So they're just not good enough to me yet that I'm able to put them any higher. But if you look at their schedule, if they can catch a couple breaks, they might be able to do a little something. You know, get Iowa at home, Minnesota at home, Michigan State at home, Purdue at home, you know, play at Indiana, who's not that good. I'd be surprised if they win it, but they're that team that kind of like, they're that dark horse. They got enough athletes, and you know, they got Tommy DeVito's he's transferred in he's the quarterback, right? Tommy DeVito, yeah. You know, maybe the light finally goes on for him. I got him 5th right now. I could see them maybe jumping up a spot or two if some things go their way. But I'll tell you this too, Sean, I do think the margin for error is tight enough to where they could finish 6th because I actually think Purdue's got a better team than Illinois. I think Purdue's schedule's harder. And that was part of why I went with them over Purdue.
I think they were 2nd. I'm going to start this from a recruiting standpoint. They were 2nd for Malik Elzy. What's the kid from downstate that they got that Notre Dame kind of
Fagan.
Fagan.
Yep.
They get the Fagan kid. They got some absolute wonderful athletes from Kenwood, Simeon, that are coming down there, and they're still on some other guys from 23. So he's done a great job, but he has really done a great job of getting big-time offensive linemen for the suburban areas of Chicago and downstate to commit to the program. And that's what he did last year. Like, if you were watching the games and you were watching, like, them pick up L after L, you were saying to yourself, okay, typical Illinois. But what you were seeing was no matter what happened on the scoreboard, he made sure that they established the identity of who they were. Yeah, right. We're getting blasted, but we're going to run this ball. We're going to run the ball down your throat. They had a freshman, McCray, just a bowling ball, 240 pounds, gets behind that big offensive line, and you saw him. He had a great day. He pretty much was the reason they won the Penn State game. They controlled the clock, other than Penn State just being awful offensively. But that was a really good Penn State defense.
Yes.
Even though P.J. Mustipher was hurt, that was still a pretty formidable defense. And they lined up and ran the ball right at Penn State. And they did it against Nebraska.
Yeah.
They did it against Iowa. That was their identity.
That's one of my issues for them, Sean, is they lost 3 of those 5 guys.
Yes.
Right?
They did.
That's the concern for me. Because you're right. Their O-line battled last year. They were physical.
But I trust the staff, and I trust Brett Bielema, to develop, get guys developed, and to be able to start a pipeline where that offensive line is going to be consistent. And that, once again, that quarterback play was so awful. Like, never take a quarterback transfer from Michigan. That's not a good idea. It's not a good idea. And their biggest playmaker, who was a quarterback recruit out of East St. Louis, Isaiah Williams, he's going to be a big playmaker at wide receiver. So they have
you got a couple receivers that can run.
Yeah, they have skilled position guys, and they have running backs. So that's if the
and that's what gives me a chance to think that they could, like, if the light goes on for Tommy DeVito a little bit, it was a big recruit for Syracuse.
Yeah,
that's the thing, is they have the athletes to where they can rip off a big play against Wisconsin, where I don't think Wisconsin's going to be ripping off big plays in the pass game against them, kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, and because like you said, like they're not quite Maryland athletically, but it's similar to the argument that I made against Maryland, is if they can get if the quarterback plays well, they're going to present some problems.
They're going to present some problems. I agree with that. I agree with that.
Purdue's an interesting team, Sean, at 6 because
did they tempt you because of the coach?
Yes.
The coach tempted me.
Yes, to put them higher because of Jeff Brom.
Yes.
But they just lost too much talent.
Yeah.
And the schedule is not fun.
No.
I mean, it's not a fun schedule. And, you know, they're another team that I look at last year and I say, you know, they won a lot of games where you're like, you know, I don't know how they won that game. Right? Like, if they play that, like if they played Michigan State a week later, Michigan State just runs it down their throat and probably beats them. But on that day, they took it to Michigan State, and it helped that Michigan State had the worst pass defense I've probably ever seen at the Big Ten level. But the problem for me with with Wisconsin, Purdue this year is I just think their schedule's rough. You know, for them, they play at home, start off against Penn State at home. I don't think they're going to beat Penn State. If they win that game, however, I'm going to completely change my opinion of this Purdue football team. But they lost too much in secondary. They lost Karlaftis. I mean, no team lost a more dynamic 1-2 punch relative, like, of the second-tier teams. Like, Ohio State can lose the kids they lost a receiver, and okay, fine. Purdue doesn't have another David Bell ready to walk onto the field, right? And then losing Milton Wright hurt them as well. And you know, Charlie Jones is a nice player, but he's not like, oh, we're okay losing David Bell because Charlie Jones is here. You know, their offensive line, it was not great. So when I look at them, you got at Minnesota, at Maryland, home against Nebraska, at Wisconsin, home against Iowa, at Illinois. And, you know, if they're in good shape there, they should finish well, get Northwestern at home, and then at Indiana. I think you can win both of those games. But it's kind of like, man, you'd rather have Maryland at home this year, you know, and Nebraska on the road, because you're going to beat Maryland at home. You may lose to Nebraska at home. You know what I mean? Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, sometimes it's not just who you play, but it's where you play them. And, you know, the Illinois, I'd much rather have Illinois at home this year. I'd much rather have Maryland at home this year. You know, games where, you know, now it's a little bit tougher game, but then you got to play teams that are better than you at home, Iowa and Nebraska and Penn State. So that's kind of where I look at it and I say, man, I just don't see a lot of margin for error with them, and they just don't have that David Bell cat that can just go out there and say, I'm going to take this one.
Dominate.
I'm going to take this game over, fellas, and go do what I got to do. And I just in a division that's just so close, 1 through 6. I mean, Purdue's again. Pick Purdue's 6, Sean. Would it shock you if they finished 3rd?
It wouldn't shock me if they found a way to be number 2.
Yeah, I mean, that's just the way that the league is. It's just but I'm looking at it last year, man. Like they go out there and you know, some of these games that they win, and it's like, you know, beat Michigan State. Do you have someone that's going to go catch 11 balls for 217 yards like David Bell did last year? When they beat Iowa 24-7 at Iowa. Okay, David Bell had 11 catches for 240 yards. You don't have that dude this year. You know, like you beat Oregon State by 9. David Bell, 8 catches for 134 yards. You don't have that guy this year. And you lost Milton Wright. So I think they're going to kind of take a step back, and they're just a team like that just can't lose a Karlaftis and a David Bell in the same year and keep rolling. And Aiden O'Donnell's a great story, but
great bowl game against Tennessee.
Yeah. But it's kind of like Spencer Saunders from Oklahoma State. I don't think that's going to be the catalyst to all of a sudden making him a great passer.
Yeah.
You know, Dave, it was a great bowl game, but he still got beat out by Jack Plummer for a reason.
Right.
You know, look, Jeff Brom knows quarterbacks, right? He started Jack Plummer for a reason, right? Because he just knows O'Donnell's limited physically. Yeah. He's just limited physically.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I'm at. So
Yeah.
I have them 6th, and then I think Northwestern's going to be the worst team in the Big Ten this year. I do.
They were just in the Big Ten championship not too long ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
Their roster's not good, Sean.
I can tell you what, though, they can recruit defensive backs.
Well, they've all transferred or gone to the NFL.
Well, they recruit, develop, and then.
Well, and the other thing too is they're not the same without their D coordinator.
No.
And I think that's the thing that's hurt them as well, is not having him. And what's it, Hankwitz, right? And now you say his last name. Not having him, I think that's hurt them. I do. He was really good. Like, he was there a long time, right? And it's like Parker at Iowa. Like, those guys just, I mean, they were just happy where they were, right? I mean, they just, like, I love being at the school. There's not saying pressure. I get these kids that are hard workers, or it's not the 5-star kids. These kids just want to go out and play ball, and they're coachable and teachable, and just was a great fit for them, and same thing with Parker at Iowa. I just don't think they have the talent. Honestly, I just think their skill talent's mediocre at best. Their lines, you've got Peter Skoronski and then a lot of nothing beside him, in my opinion. And then their defense is incredibly slow in the front 7, in my opinion.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, I mean, like a couple. This is like a few. Like, you had Ernest Brown, and you had the big kid at defensive tackle, and you had the linebackers, and it's like that. And then you had like a legit first round. You had legitimate 2 first-round caliber talents in the secondary, and then 2 years later, you look at what they are now, and you're like, oh my gosh, like, how did that happen? So I just
once again, their best players, if you look at any publication, the best players are their 2 defensive backs.
Yep.
Cameron Mitchell and AJ Hampton. That's like I said, they can recruit. Like, dude, they can go find.
Yeah.
Without it being a 4-star, they can go find some really, really fast and really good defensive backs and develop them.
Right.
But unfortunately, and they used to be really good in the trenches.
Right. They were at least tough.
They were really built on the trenches.
Remember Mike Elko and them, they tried to flip Ernest Brown. Notre Dame tried to flip Ernest Brown. I mean, he was a good player, and they got 3 defensive linemen in that class who were good football players. Those guys are all gone now. And they just haven't replaced them. Now, they're recruiting really, really well right now, but that's just that's not going to help them this year, Sean.
Yeah.
It's not going to help them this year.